The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my downtown office. Grandfather had died peacefully in his sleep at 87, the lawyer said, and I was now the sole inheritor of his 200-acre farm in rural Kentucky. I hadn't been back to that place in 15 years. Not since the awkward family gatherings had finally petered out after grandmother's funeral. My wife Jennifer looked up from her laptop when I ended the call, already reading the conflicted emotions on my face. "You're going to sell it, right?" she asked, though we both knew the answer was more complicated than that. The farm represented the last connection to a family legacy I'd spent my adult life trying to escape, but it also represented financial security our young family desperately needed. "I should at least go see what we're dealing with," I said. "Maybe take Emma with me for the weekend, let her see where her dad grew up." Our 8-year-old daughter had been begging for months to visit the mysterious farm Grandpa Joe had told her stories about during his rare visits to our suburban home. To her, it was a magical place where animals roamed free and vegetables grew in endless rows. She had no idea why I'd avoided it for so long, or why my jaw clenched every time she asked about visiting. The drive from Louisville took 3 hours through increasingly sparse countryside. Emma chattered excitedly in the back seat, pointing out every cow and barn we passed, building up elaborate fantasies about what we'd find at Grandpa Joe's farm. I found myself remembering my own childhood excitement during these same drives, back when the farm had seemed like paradise instead of the complicated, oppressive place it had become in my teenage memories. "Why did you stop visiting Grandpa Joe?" Emma asked as we turned onto the gravel road that led to the farmhouse. "Adult stuff," I said, using the catch-all explanation that had served me well through her childhood. "Sometimes families have disagreements about things." The truth was more complicated than I wanted to explain to an 8-year-old. I'd stopped visiting because of the arguments, the accusations, the way grandfather's face would darken whenever I expressed interest in anything beyond the boundaries of his property. He'd wanted me to stay, to learn the family business, to carry on traditions I'd never fully understood. I'd wanted college, a career in the city, a life that didn't smell like fertilizer and livestock. The farmhouse came into view as we crested the small hill that marked the property's entrance. It looked smaller than I remembered, the white paint more faded, the wraparound porch sagging slightly under the weight of accumulated years. But the land itself was still breathtaking, rolling fields that stretched to the horizon, divided by neat fence lines and punctuated by clusters of old-growth oak trees. "It's huge," Emma squealed, pressing her face against the car window. "Are all those fields ours now?" "They belong to our family, yes," I said carefully, still not sure what we'd do with the inheritance. Keeping the farm would mean massive lifestyle changes none of us were prepared for. Selling it would mean letting go of 5 generations of family history. The lawyer had given me keys and warned me that the house would need work before it could be considered livable. Grandfather had been increasingly reclusive in his final years, letting both the house and his personal hygiene deteriorate, as he focused obsessively on maintaining his crops. The local county had performed welfare checks a few times, but he'd always passed their minimal standards for independent living. Inside, the house smelled like dust and old cooking grease, with an underlying odor I couldn't quite identify. Emma wrinkled her nose but gamely followed me through rooms filled with decades of accumulated possessions. Grandfather had apparently never thrown anything away. Newspapers from the 1980s were stacked in corners, and every surface was covered with tools, receipts, and handwritten notes in his spidery script. "What's that smell?" Emma asked as we climbed the stairs to the second floor. "Old house smell," I said, though I was wondering the same thing. It was organic and slightly sweet, like flowers that had been left too long in water. Stronger near the back of the house, where Grandfather's bedroom was located. The bedroom itself was surprisingly neat compared to the rest of the house. The bed was made with military precision, and the surfaces were clear except for a few personal items. A pocket watch, reading glasses, and a leather journal I'd never seen before. The smell was definitely stronger here, coming from somewhere nearby. Emma had discovered a window that looked out over the backfields and was narrating what she saw to her imaginary audience. "The corn is really tall, and there are rows and rows of it, and I think I see a scarecrow, but it looks kind of weird." Quote, I picked up the journal, curious about what thoughts Grandfather had been recording in his final years. The entries were dated starting about 5 years ago, written in the careful penmanship of someone who'd been educated in an era when handwriting mattered. March 15th. The new seeds arrived today. Belgian supplier as always. Instructions are clear, but the germination process will take patience. Must maintain strict temperature controls in the greenhouse. April 2nd. First shoots are appearing. Growth rate is remarkable, much faster than the traditional varieties. The color is unusual, but within expected parameters according to the documentation. May 10th. The plants are responding well to the specialized fertilizer mixture. Neighbor Thompson asked about my greenhouse operations again. Told him I'm experimenting with heirloom tomatoes. He seemed satisfied with that explanation. The entries continued through the summer, describing what sounded like an ordinary gardening project, but something about the tone felt off. Grandfather wrote about his plants with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to growing vegetables, and he was clearly being secretive about what he was actually cultivating. "Daddy, come look at this," Emma called from the window. "The scarecrow moved." I joined her at the window, expecting to see fabric fluttering in the breeze. Instead, I saw a figure standing in the far field that definitely wasn't a scarecrow. It was a person, motionless among the corn rows, too distant to make out clearly but unmistakably human in shape. "Stay here," I told Emma, suddenly feeling protective in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of childhood fears I had thought I'd outgrown. "I'm gonna go see who that is." "Can I come?" "No, stay in the house. I'll be right back." I made my way through the overgrown backyard toward the fields, following what had once been a clear path between the garden beds. The corn was indeed unusually tall, well over my head, and the plants looked different from any variety I remembered from childhood visits. The stalks were thicker, with an almost waxy quality to their surfaces, and the leaves had a strange blue-green tint that made them look artificial. As I pushed through the rows toward where I'd seen the figure, the sweet smell I'd noticed in the house grew stronger. It was definitely coming from the plants themselves, a cloying fragrance that reminded me of funeral flowers. The corn ears, when I could see them through the dense foliage, were unusual too, larger than normal and covered in husks that had an oily, iridescent quality. I reached the area where I'd seen the figure but found nothing except more rows of strange corn. The plants rustled around me in a way that seemed too purposeful for random wind, and I had the uncomfortable feeling of being watched from multiple directions. The sweet smell was so strong here that it was making me slightly nauseous. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish but unable to shake the sense that someone was nearby. "This is private property." No response except the continued rustling of leaves. I was about to turn back when I noticed something pale at the base of one of the cornstalks. Kneeling down to investigate, I found what looked like a bundle of cloth wrapped around something roughly the size and shape of a football. The cloth was stained and decomposing, but as I unwrapped it carefully, I realized I was looking at bones. Small bones, delicate ones, arranged in a pattern that suggested they'd once been part of a complete skeleton. At the center of the arrangement was a seed pod, unlike anything I'd ever seen, about the size of a golf ball, with a surface that seemed to pulse gently in the dim light filtering through the corn leaves. I dropped the bundle and stumbled backward, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd found. The logical explanation was that some animal had died in the field and grandfather had buried it, but the careful arrangement of bones and the presence of that weird seed pod suggested something more deliberate. Racing back to the house, I found Emma still at the bedroom window, but she was no longer looking at the fields. She was staring down at something in the yard directly below. "Daddy, there are more people now," she said matter-of-factly. "They're just standing there." I looked out the window and felt my blood freeze. There were indeed more figures now, at least 6 of them, scattered around the property at seemingly random intervals. They stood perfectly still, like mannequins someone had posed throughout the landscape. From this distance, I couldn't make out faces or details, but there was something wrong with their proportions, something that made them look almost human, but not quite. "Emma, we're leaving, right now." "But we just got here. You said we could explore the farm." "Something's wrong here. We need to go back to town and figure out what's going on." I grabbed the journal and hurried Emma downstairs, but as we reached the front door, I realized the figures had moved. They were closer to the house now, forming a loose semicircle around the front yard. Still motionless, still silent, but definitely repositioned from where they'd been moments before. "Who are they?" Emma whispered, finally picking up on my fear. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we're gonna get in the car very quickly and drive away, okay?" The figures didn't move as we walked to the car, but I could feel them watching us. Up close, they looked even more disturbing. Pale, thin people wearing clothes that looked like they'd been buried for years. Their faces were gaunt and expressionless, and their eyes reflected light in a way that reminded me of nocturnal animals. We drove away in tense silence, Emma sensing that something was seriously wrong but not understanding what. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway that I felt safe enough to pull over and try to process what we'd encountered. The journal entries took on new significance as I read through them again in the car. References to traditional varieties and specialized fertilizer mixture suggested grandfather had been growing something other than ordinary crops. The mention of Belgian suppliers and temperature controls indicated a level of sophistication that went far beyond hobby gardening. But it was the final entries dated just weeks before his death that made my hands shake as I read them. "The harvest is almost ready. The commune members are showing excellent adaptation to the new diet. Physical changes are accelerating as expected." Dr. Van Houten's research was correct. The symbiotic relationship between plant and human consciousness is stronger than we anticipated. Some of the members are expressing doubts about the process, but it's too late to reverse now. The plants require their hosts to remain stationary during daylight hours to optimize photosynthetic efficiency. Movement is restricted to necessary functions only. I understand now why the previous generation of my family left this place. They couldn't see the potential, couldn't appreciate the beauty of what we're creating here. But I've found others who understand. The community is growing, and soon we'll have enough members to expand to neighboring properties. The pieces were falling into place in a way that made me feel sick. Grandfather hadn't been growing unusual vegetables. He'd been cultivating some kind of parasitic plant that somehow affected human behavior. Those figures we'd seen weren't visitors or trespassers. They were people who'd been changed by whatever grandfather had been feeding them. I thought about the bone bundle I'd found, the careful arrangement that suggested ritual purpose. How many people had disappeared over the years? How long had this been going on? And why had grandfather left the farm to me if he knew what was growing there? The drive home passed in a blur of increasingly frantic phone calls. I tried reaching the local sheriff's office, but the deputy who answered seemed reluctant to take my concerns seriously. Strange people standing in fields wasn't exactly a high-priority emergency, especially on property that technically belonged to me. I called the lawyer who'd handled the inheritance, but he'd left for vacation and wouldn't be available for a week. His assistant confirmed that grandfather had been specific about leaving the property to me, with instructions that I should continue the important work being done there. She had no idea what kind of work he'd been referring to. Jennifer was waiting in our driveway when we arrived home, her face tight with worry. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said as Emma ran inside to tell her stuffed animals about the strange farm adventure. "Worse than a ghost," I said, handing her the journal. "I think my grandfather was involved in some kind of cult. And I think those people are still living on the property." Reading the journal entries drained the color from Jennifer's face. "We have to call the police," she said. "This sounds like kidnapping, or worse." I tried. "They don't seem to think it's urgent." "Then we call the FBI. This is human trafficking. Or some kind of mind control situation. People don't just stand around in fields all day, unless something is seriously wrong." She was right, but I dreaded the investigation that would follow. Our names would be in the papers, connected to whatever horrors grandfather had been perpetrating. Emma would grow up knowing her family legacy included something monstrous. And there was still the question of what to do with the property itself. Could we sell land that was apparently being used for some kind of human experimentation? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale figures standing motionless in the fields, and I wondered how many of them had once been normal people with families who missed them. The sweet smell from the corn seemed to linger in my nostrils, and I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on our doors and windows. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and went to my computer to research the name I'd seen in grandfather's journal, Dr. Van Houten. What I found made everything worse. Dr. Henrik Van Houten had been a Belgian botanist who disappeared in the 1970s while researching symbiotic relationships between plants and human neural systems. His last published paper, available through an obscure academic database, described theoretical methods for creating plant-human hybrid organisms that could survive through photosynthesis while maintaining rudimentary human consciousness. The paper had been widely discredited by the scientific community, and Van Houten had lost his university position shortly before his disappearance. But according to grandfather's journal, Van Houten's research had been correct, and grandfather had somehow obtained seeds or specimens that allowed him to continue the work. The implications were staggering. If Van Houten's theories were accurate, those figures in the fields weren't just people under the influence of some drug or cult indoctrination. They were people who'd been physically altered, transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. I printed out everything I could find about Van Houten's research and spent the rest of the night making detailed notes about what we'd observed at the farm. By morning, I had enough evidence to convince the FBI that this warranted serious investigation, but I also had a sick certainty that our family's life was about to be turned upside down. The media attention started 3 days after the FBI raid on the farm. By then, they'd found 17 people living in various outbuildings on the property, all in advanced stages of what the preliminary medical reports described as unprecedented physiological modification. The victims showed signs of chlorophyll production in their skin cells, dramatically reduced metabolic requirements, and neural changes that severely limited their cognitive function and mobility. Most disturbing was the discovery that several of the victims had been reported missing over a period of years, from locations as far away as California and Maine. Grandfather had apparently been recruiting people through online forums related to alternative agriculture and sustainable living, promising them a chance to participate in revolutionary research that would solve world hunger. The farm itself was declared a biohazard site. The unusual corn and other modified plants were destroyed by a team of specialists in hazmat suits. But not before researchers had documented the extent of Van Houten's genetic modifications. The plants had indeed been engineered to form symbiotic relationships with human hosts, essentially turning people into living components of a hybrid ecosystem. Emma had trouble understanding why we couldn't go back to Grandpa Joe's farm, and why reporters kept calling our house asking about our family's connection to what the newspapers were calling the Kentucky plant horror. We tried to shield her from the worst details, but it was impossible to completely protect her from the reality that her great-grandfather had been a monster. The lawsuit started a month later. Families of the victims sued our estate, claiming we should have known about grandfather's activities and done something to stop them. Insurance companies refused to cover the legal costs, arguing that intentional criminal activity wasn't covered under our policies. The farm, now a contaminated crime scene, was worthless as collateral for the mounting legal expenses. Jennifer lost her job when her employer decided the negative publicity was bad for business. Parents at Emma's school started treating her differently, and we eventually had to transfer her to a private school across town where fewer people knew about our connection to the case. The psychological toll was even worse than the financial one. I found myself obsessing over memories of childhood visits to the farm, wondering if I'd seen signs of grandfather's activities that I'd been too young to understand. Had there always been strange people lurking in the fields? Had the sweet smell always been there? Why hadn't I recognized that something was wrong? Dr. Sarah Martinez, the psychiatrist we started seeing as a family, helped me understand that children aren't equipped to recognize adult evil, especially when it's perpetrated by someone they trust. Your grandfather was skilled at compartmentalizing his activities, she explained. He showed you a normal farm operation while hiding the experiments in areas you never saw. Quote, but understanding the psychology didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. 17 people had been transformed into living plants because of something my family had done, and I was the one who'd inherited the responsibility for that legacy. The criminal investigation revealed that grandfather had been working with a network of other researchers who'd been inspired by Van Houten's work. Farms in Oregon, Mississippi, and Northern California were raided, yielding similar discoveries of modified plants and hybrid victims. The FBI estimated that over 100 people had been subjected to various stages of the transformation process. Most of the other researchers were arrested, but several had disappeared along with their research materials. Agent Patricia Williams, who'd been assigned to coordinate the multi-state investigation, warned us that the network was likely larger than they'd discovered, and that some cells might still be operating. "Your grandfather was methodical about documentation," Agent Williams explained during one of our interviews. "His records helped us understand the full scope of the network, but that also means other members of the network know about your family's involvement. We recommend you consider relocating until we can be certain all the cells have been neutralized." The idea of running away from our home, our jobs, our entire life felt like letting grandfather's evil win. But we also couldn't ignore the anonymous phone calls that had started after our names appeared in the news, or the strangers who'd been photographed near Emma's school by security cameras. "They're not going to stop," Jennifer said one evening as we discussed our options. "This is bigger than just your grandfather. We're connected to something that's still ongoing, and the people involved aren't going to forget that we were the ones who exposed them." She was right, but the financial reality was that we couldn't afford to relocate. The legal bills had consumed our savings, the house was mortgaged to pay for lawyers, and both of our careers had been derailed by the scandal. We were trapped by circumstances that had started with an inheritance I'd never wanted. The breakthrough came 6 months later, when one of the arrested researchers agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Dr. Michael Chen had been working with grandfather for over a decade, and his testimony revealed details about the network that changed everything we thought we knew about the scope of the conspiracy. "The plant modification project was just the beginning," Dr. Chen told prosecutors. Van Houten's research had identified multiple pathways for human enhancement through biological symbiosis. The goal was to create a new form of human existence that could survive environmental catastrophe through integration with modified plant life. According to Chen's testimony, the network had been preparing for what they saw as the inevitable collapse of industrial civilization. Their hybrid creatures weren't just experiments. They were prototypes for a post-apocalyptic human species that could survive through photosynthesis and minimal resource consumption. "Joseph Morrison, your grandfather, was one of the most committed members," Chen continued. "He believed that traditional humans were a dead end, and that only through radical biological modification could our species survive the coming environmental crisis." The testimony revealed that grandfather had left me the farm not as a gift, but as a recruitment tool. The network had expected that exposure to the modified plants and hybrid creatures would gradually convert me to their worldview. If that failed, they'd planned to use my family as leverage to force my cooperation with their research. Morrison specifically chose his grandson because he believed family loyalty would overcome moral objections, Chen explained. The network needed someone with legal ownership of the property to continue the research without attracting attention from authorities. Learning that my inheritance had been part of an elaborate manipulation scheme was somehow both horrifying and relieving. It meant I'd never been in real danger of becoming like grandfather. His evil hadn't been genetic or inevitable, but it also meant that Emma and Jennifer were still at risk from network members who might try to complete grandfather's plan. The FBI's investigation culminated in raids across 7 states, resulting in over 30 arrests and the rescue of more than 60 victims in various stages of biological modification. The advanced cases, including the people we'd encountered at grandfather's farm, couldn't be reversed, but they were moved to a specialized medical facility where they could be cared for safely. Media coverage of the wider conspiracy helped shift public perception of our family's role in the scandal. Instead of being seen as complicit in grandfather's crimes, we were increasingly portrayed as victims who'd helped expose a dangerous network. The lawsuits against our estate were dropped as families realized we'd had no prior knowledge of the experiments. But the damage to our family had already been done. Jennifer and I struggled to rebuild trust in a relationship that had been strained by months of stress and uncertainty. Emma, now 9 years old, had developed anxiety about strangers and an obsessive need to know where her parents were at all times. Our financial situation had stabilized, but we were still paying legal bills that would take years to resolve. Dr. Martinez continued working with us to process the trauma of learning that someone we'd trusted had been capable of such monstrous acts. Betrayal by family members creates a unique form of psychological injury, she explained. Children especially need help understanding that evil actions by relatives don't reflect their own moral character or family identity. Emma's recovery was complicated by her age and the public nature of the scandal. Children at school knew about her connection to the plant horror case, and some parents had forbidden their children from playing with her. We had to help her understand that she wasn't responsible for her great-grandfather's crimes, while also teaching her to cope with the social isolation those crimes had created. "Why did Grandpa Joe hurt those people?" she asked during one of our family therapy sessions. "He got confused about what was right and wrong," I said, using the language Dr. Martinez had taught us. "Sometimes adults make terrible choices, even when they know better. That doesn't mean everyone in their family is bad. But people think our family is bad now. Some people do, because they don't understand that you can't control what other people choose to do. But the people who really matter, our friends, our family who love us, they know that you're not responsible for choices you didn't make." The conversation reminded me of discussions I'd had with my own parents about family disappointments and moral failures. Every family carries some burden of shame, some relative whose choices create complications for future generations. What made our situation unusual was the scale and public nature of grandfather's crimes, but the basic challenge was universal: how to maintain family identity while rejecting family evil. As Emma's 10th birthday approached, we decided to have a small celebration that focused on moving forward rather than dwelling on the past year's trauma. We invited her closest friends from the new school, planned activities that had nothing to do with agriculture or plants, and worked to create positive memories that could balance the difficult ones. The party was a success, with Emma laughing and playing with the carefree joy we'd been afraid she might never recover. Watching her blow out birthday candles, I realized that our family's story didn't have to be defined by what grandfather had done. We could choose to be defined by how we'd responded to learning the truth, by our commitment to helping victims and supporting justice, by our determination to protect our daughter from inheriting guilt that wasn't hers to carry. Agent Williams attended the party, having become something of a family friend during the long investigation. She brought news that the last known members of Van Houten's network had been arrested in Canada, effectively ending the threat to our family's safety. "You should know that your decision to report what you found probably saved lives," she told us as the party wound down. "The network was planning to expand their operations significantly. Your grandfather's documentation gave us everything we needed to shut them down completely." The knowledge that our trauma had served a purpose helped with the healing process, but it didn't erase the fundamental violation of trust that had started everything. Learning that someone you loved was capable of monstrous acts changes you in ways that never fully heal. You become more suspicious, more careful about trusting others, more aware of the potential for evil in ordinary situations. But it also teaches you about the importance of choosing good when evil would be easier, about the responsibility that comes with knowledge of wrongdoing, about the strength that comes from facing difficult truths instead of hiding from them. The farm was eventually sold to the state of Kentucky, which converted it into a memorial for the victims of Van Houten's research network. The contaminated areas were remediated and replanted with native species, and a small monument was erected to honor the people who'd been harmed by the experiments conducted there. Emma and I visited the memorial on the 2nd anniversary of our discovery, bringing flowers to leave at the monument. The fields looked completely different now. Rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers instead of the towering rows of modified corn that had hidden such horrors. "It looks peaceful now," Emma said as we stood by the monument reading the names of victims who'd been identified. "That's what it should have been all along," I replied. "Just a peaceful place where good things could grow." As we drove away from the memorial, I realized that our family's connection to that place had been transformed from something shameful into something meaningful. We weren't the family that had enabled evil. We were the family that had exposed it. Our inheritance hadn't been a farm full of horrors. It had been an opportunity to help bring justice to people who deserved it. The scars would always remain. Emma would always be the girl whose great-grandfather had been involved in the plant horror case. Jennifer and I would always carry the stress of that terrible year when our entire world had been upended by the discovery of family evil. But we'd also always be the family that had chosen to do the right thing when it would have been easier to walk away. That choice, made in a moment of horror and revulsion in a field of modified corn, had defined us more completely than any inheritance ever could. We'd learned that family legacy isn't just what you inherit, it's what you choose to do with that inheritance. And we'd chosen to turn a legacy of evil into a legacy of justice. The farm was gone, but the lessons remained. Evil can hide in the most ordinary places, perpetrated by the most trusted people, disguised as progress or necessity or love. But good people have the power to expose that evil, to choose differently, to break cycles of harm that might otherwise continue for generations. Our family had been destroyed and rebuilt by what we'd discovered growing in grandfather's fields. But in the end, we'd grown something better from the ashes: integrity, courage, and the kind of love that refuses to enable evil, even when that evil wears a familiar face. The monsters were gone, the victims were safe, and our daughter was free to write her own story without the burden of inherited shame. That was the real inheritance grandfather had left us. Not land or money or family tradition, but the opportunity to choose who we wanted to be when faced with the worst of human nature. We'd chosen well, and that choice had saved us all. Our family had been destroyed and rebuilt by what we'd discovered growing in grandfather's fields. But in the end, we'd grown something better from the ashes: integrity, courage, and the kind of love that refuses to enable evil, even when that evil wears a familiar face. The monsters were gone, the victims were safe, and our daughter was free to write her own story without the burden of inherited shame. That was the real inheritance grandfather had left us. Not land or money or family tradition, but the opportunity to choose who we wanted to be when faced with the worst of human nature. We'd chosen well, and that choice had saved us all. 3 years later, when Emma was 13, she came home from school with an assignment that would test everything we'd learned about family legacy and personal responsibility. Her history teacher had asked the class to research their family genealogy and present on a relative who had made a significant impact on their community. "I want to do my project on Great-Grandpa Joe," she announced over dinner, her tone carefully neutral in the way teenagers perfected when they were testing boundaries. Jennifer and I exchanged glances across the table. We'd always known this moment would come, when Emma would need to wrestle with her family history on her own terms, without our careful mediation and age-appropriate explanations. "That's a complex choice, sweetheart," I said carefully. "What angle are you thinking of taking?" "I want to research how people become evil," Emma said, with the blunt directness that had emerged as her dominant personality trait since the trauma. "Like, was he always bad, or did something happen to make him that way? And I want to understand how families recover when someone they trusted turns out to be a monster." Her use of clinical language, words she'd learned in therapy sessions and overheard in our conversations with lawyers and investigators, reminded me that she'd grown up faster than we'd wanted her to. At 13, she had a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and moral complexity that most adults never developed. Dr. Martinez, who we still saw periodically for family check-ins, had warned us this phase would come. "Adolescents need to construct their own understanding of traumatic family events," she'd explained. "Emma will need to research and process the story independently, using her own cognitive frameworks rather than the protective narratives you've provided." The prospect of Emma diving deep into grandfather's history terrified me. We'd shared the basic facts as she'd gotten older, but we'd never exposed her to the full documentation of his crimes, the detailed victim testimonies, the horrific medical reports, the evidence of how systematically he'd recruited and manipulated vulnerable people. "I think that's a brave choice," Jennifer said, always the more direct parent. "But you need to understand that researching something this disturbing can be psychologically difficult. Are you prepared for that?" "Mom, I've been living with this my whole life," Emma replied with typical teenage exasperation. "Kids at school still make jokes about our family. I get weird looks when people find out my last name. I think it's time I actually understood what happened instead of just knowing the sanitized version you guys have been giving me." She had a point. Our protective instincts had kept her somewhat insulated from the full horror of what grandfather had done, But that protection had also left her vulnerable to speculation and rumor. Kids her age were sophisticated enough to find information online, and she'd probably already seen things we didn't know about. Okay, I said, making a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. But we do this together. You don't research this alone, and you don't rely on random internet sources. If you want to understand what really happened, we'll help you access the accurate information. That weekend, we sat down with boxes of documents that had been sealed away since the trial ended. FBI reports, medical evaluations of victims, psychological profiles of network members, and most difficult of all, grandfather's own writings. Not just the journal I'd found, but years of correspondence with other researchers and detailed plans for expanding their operations. Emma approached the material with the methodical intensity she brought to all her academic projects. She took notes, asked clarifying questions, and insisted on understanding not just what had happened, but why people had made the choices they'd made. He really believed he was saving humanity, she said after reading through a collection of grandfather's letters to Dr. Chen. Like, he genuinely thought that turning people into plant hybrids was going to help them survive climate change and resource depletion. Does that make it less evil? I asked, curious about her moral reasoning. Emma considered this carefully. No, but it makes it more understandable. Evil people who know they're evil are scary. But evil people who think they're heroes are scarier, because they can justify anything. Her insight was more sophisticated than many adults managed. She understood that grandfather's self-deception had been part of what made him dangerous, that his genuine belief in his mission had allowed him to rationalize causing tremendous harm. The victims thought they were volunteering for agricultural research, she continued, reading from victim testimony transcripts. He told them they'd be helping develop sustainable food systems. Some of them were environmental activists who thought they were joining a commune focused on alternative living. What does that tell you about how predators operate? Jennifer asked. They find people who want to do good things, and then they twist those good intentions into something horrible. The victims weren't stupid or weak. They were people who cared about important problems and trusted someone who claimed to have solutions. This understanding seemed to give Emma a framework for processing not just grandfather's crimes, but the broader questions about trust, authority, and moral responsibility that the experience had raised. She was developing her own ethical compass based on our family's experience, rather than simply inheriting our conclusions. The most difficult part of Emma's research involved reading about the long-term medical condition of the victims who'd been successfully converted by grandfather's experiments. 17 people were living in a specialized care facility, their bodies permanently altered in ways that couldn't be reversed. Can we visit them? Emma asked after reading a medical update report. The request surprised me. Why would you want to do that? Because they're part of our family's story. If Great-Grandpa Joe hurt them, and our family exposed what happened to them, then we have a responsibility to them. They're still alive, still dealing with what he did. Shouldn't we at least acknowledge that? Dr. Martinez thought Emma's instinct was psychologically healthy. She's trying to transform inherited guilt into constructive action, she explained. Visiting the victims could help her understand that family responsibility isn't about carrying shame for others' choices, but about making choices that honor the people who were harmed. Arranging the visit took months of coordination with medical staff, legal representatives, and family members of victims who were still competent to consent to visitors. The facility was located in Colorado, built specifically to care for the unique medical needs of people whose physiological systems had been permanently altered. Dr. Rebecca Santos, the facility's director, prepared us for what we would see. The victims maintain basic cognitive function, but their metabolic and neurological systems are fundamentally different from normal humans, she explained. They require minimal nutrition because they derive energy through photosynthesis, but they also need carefully controlled light exposure and atmospheric conditions. Do they remember their lives before the conversion? Emma asked. To varying degrees. Some have clear memories and can communicate normally. Others retained only fragments of their previous personalities. The psychological impact has been as devastating as the physical changes. The facility looked more like a greenhouse than a hospital, with specialized lighting systems and carefully controlled temperature and humidity. The residents moved slowly and spoke quietly, their skin having a faint greenish tint that became more pronounced in direct light. We met with 3 residents who'd agreed to speak with us. Maria Santos had been a graduate student in environmental science when she'd joined what she thought was a research commune. Robert Kim had been a military veteran struggling with PTSD who'd been attracted to grandfather's promises of community and purpose. Linda Morrison, no relation despite sharing our surname, had been a single mother looking for an alternative lifestyle for herself and her daughter. "I don't blame your family," Maria told Emma during our conversation. "Your great-grandfather was very convincing. He made us believe we were pioneers, that we were helping create a better world. By the time we realized what was really happening, the process was too advanced to stop." "Are you angry?" Emma asked. "I was for a long time. Angry at him. Angry at myself for being fooled. Angry at my family for not stopping me from leaving with him. But anger takes energy I don't have anymore. Now I'm focused on helping other people understand how these kinds of situations develop, so maybe it won't happen to anyone else." Robert Kim had a different perspective. "I'm grateful your family exposed what was happening," he told us. "Not because it helped me, it was too late for that, but because it prevented other people from going through this. Your great-grandfather had plans to recruit dozens more people. He was building toward something much larger." The visit was emotionally exhausting for all of us, but Emma seemed to find it cathartic. She'd been able to apologize directly to people who'd been harmed by our family member, and she'd heard from them that our actions in exposing grandfather had been meaningful and helpful. "They're still people," she said on the flight home. "I mean, they've been changed in terrible ways, but they're still themselves. They're not victims anymore, they're survivors." Emma's research project became something much larger than a school assignment. She spent months compiling a comprehensive analysis of how grandfather had recruited victims, how the network had operated, and how families could recognize and respond to similar manipulation tactics. Her presentation to her history class was so thorough and compelling that her teacher asked her to present it to other classes as well. Word spread, and soon Emma was being invited to speak at conferences about cult recruitment and family trauma recovery. "The most important thing I learned," Emma told audiences, "is that evil doesn't always look evil. My great-grandfather seemed like a normal person who cared about the environment and wanted to help solve world problems. The people who joined his research thought they were doing something good. Evil often disguises itself as progress or help or community. But the other thing I learned," she would continue, "is that ordinary people have the power to stop evil when they recognize it. My dad could have ignored what he found at the farm, or rationalized it, or been too scared to report it. Instead, he chose to do the right thing, even though it was hard and scary and ended up hurting our family financially and socially." Emma's speaking engagements led to opportunities I'd never expected. Advocacy organizations invited our family to help develop educational materials about recognizing and reporting dangerous cult activity. Law enforcement agencies asked us to help train investigators in recognizing sophisticated recruitment and indoctrination techniques. Most significantly, we were invited to consult on legislation that would strengthen protections for people reporting suspected cult activity and provide better resources for families whose relatives had been recruited by dangerous groups. "Your family's experience demonstrates the importance of taking reports seriously even when they seem outlandish," explained Senator Patricia Williams, who'd sponsored the legislation. "Many cult activities seem impossible to believe until they're fully investigated. We need systems that can respond appropriately to unusual but credible reports." The legislative work felt like the natural evolution of our family's response to grandfather's crimes. Instead of just surviving the trauma and moving on, we were using our experience to help prevent similar traumas for other families. But the increased public attention also brought unwanted consequences. Emma received online harassment from people who believed conspiracy theories about the plant horror case. Some claimed the whole thing had been fabricated by the government to justify increased surveillance of agricultural operations. Others insisted that grandfather had been a hero trying to solve environmental problems, and that we'd betrayed him for money or attention. People will believe anything that fits their existing worldview, Dr. Martinez explained when Emma came to therapy upset about particularly vicious online comments. Some people need to believe that dramatic evil doesn't exist, so they construct alternative explanations that make them feel safer. Other people need to believe that environmental problems justify any solution, so they see your great-grandfather as a visionary rather than a criminal. Learning to cope with public scrutiny and criticism became another part of Emma's ongoing recovery process. She had to develop thick skin while maintaining empathy, learn to distinguish between legitimate criticism and bad faith attacks, and understand that her family's story had become part of larger cultural conversations about trust, authority, and moral responsibility. As Emma entered high school, she decided she wanted to pursue a career in psychology, specifically working with families affected by cult involvement and manipulation. "I want to help people the way Dr. Martinez helped us," she explained. "I want to use what happened to our family to help other families heal from similar experiences." Her career goals meant taking advanced psychology and sociology courses, which led to independent research projects that deepened her understanding of how groups like Grandfather's Network operated. She studied historical cases of agricultural cults, environmental extremism, and scientific communities that had lost ethical moorings in pursuit of revolutionary discoveries. "The scary thing is how logical it all seems from inside the group," she told me after completing a project on the Rajneeshpuram commune in Oregon. "When you're surrounded by people who share the same beliefs and fears, when you're isolated from outside perspectives, when you trust authority figures who claim to have special knowledge, it becomes easy to rationalize almost anything." "What do you think would have happened if you'd grown up on Grandfather's farm?" I asked, curious about her assessment of her own vulnerability to manipulation. Emma considered this carefully. "I think I would have been recruited eventually. Kids are especially vulnerable because they trust adults, and they want to feel special and important. If he'd raised me believing that environmental collapse was inevitable, and that his research was the only solution, I probably would have accepted that worldview completely." Her honesty about her own potential vulnerability was both concerning and reassuring. Concerning because it meant she understood how easily anyone could be manipulated under the right circumstances. Reassuring because it meant she wouldn't be overconfident about her ability to recognize and resist manipulation in the future. The summer before Emma's senior year of high school, we received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Rebecca Santos from the Victim Care Facility called to say that Linda Morrison, one of the survivors we'd met years earlier, wanted to speak with our family about something important. Linda had been working with facility counselors to recover more detailed memories of her time in Grandfather's Network, and she'd remembered something that might be significant. She wanted to share this information with us before deciding whether to report it to law enforcement. We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a conference room at Dr. Santos's hospital that could accommodate Linda's specialized medical needs. Linda looked healthier than when we'd first met her, though the greenish tint to her skin had become more pronounced over the years. "I've been remembering more about the conversations your grandfather had with other network members," Linda began. "Especially discussions about what they called the succession plan, how the research would continue if something happened to the primary researchers." She explained that Grandfather and his colleagues had been concerned about the possibility of their network being discovered and shut down. They'd developed contingency plans that involved preserving research materials, maintaining contact with potential recruits, and eventually resuming their work in different locations. "Your grandfather was particularly worried about what would happen to the research if he died before the project was complete," Linda continued. "He talked about leaving instructions for continuing the work, and about identifying family members who might be sympathetic to the mission." The implication was clear. Grandfather's plan to leave me the farm hadn't just been about recruitment. It had been about ensuring that someone with legal authority over the property would be positioned to continue or protect the research if the network was compromised. "Did he mention any specific instructions or hidden materials?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "He talked about insurance protocols, backup storage of research data, and biological samples that could be retrieved if the primary operations were shut down. He was very secretive about the details, but he implied that these backup systems were built into properties owned by network members." The possibility that Grandfather had hidden additional research materials on the farm had never occurred to me. The FBI had thoroughly searched the property after our initial report, but they'd been looking for evidence of the known experiments, not for concealed backup systems that might be designed to survive official investigation. Do you think there might still be something hidden there? Emma asked. I don't know, Linda said, but I think your family deserves to know about these conversations before I report them to the authorities. If there are hidden materials, if there's any chance the research could be restarted, people need to know. Agent Williams, now promoted to head the FBI's domestic terrorism unit, took Linda's information seriously. She assembled a team of specialists in environmental crimes and agricultural terrorism to conduct a new, more intensive search of the memorial site that had once been grandfather's farm. We'll be looking for underground storage facilities, concealed laboratory spaces, and preserved biological materials, Agent Williams explained. These kinds of networks are often more sophisticated about operational security than we initially realize. It's possible we missed something during the first investigation. The new search required temporarily closing the memorial to public access, which meant dealing with renewed media attention and public scrutiny. Emma, now 17 and experienced in handling press inquiries, helped craft public statements that explained the situation without causing panic about potential ongoing threats. We've always been committed to ensuring that our family's property could never again be used to harm people, Emma told reporters. If there's any possibility that dangerous materials are still hidden there, we want them found and safely destroyed. The search took 3 weeks and involved ground-penetrating radar, specialized excavation equipment, and hazmat teams prepared to handle potentially dangerous biological specimens. What they found exceeded everyone's worst expectations. Buried beneath the memorial's flower garden was a sophisticated underground facility that grandfather had constructed over several years. The facility contained preserved samples of the modified plants, detailed research notes, and most disturbing of all, biological samples from victims that could potentially be used to recreate the human modification process. This was essentially a restart kit for the entire program, Agent Williams reported. If someone with the right expertise had access to these materials, they could have resumed the research with minimal delay. The facility also contained evidence that the network had been larger and more organized than previously understood. Grandfather had been in communication with researchers in 6 countries, and there were indications that similar backup facilities might exist at other locations around the world. Your grandfather wasn't just conducting experiments, Agent Williams continued. He was building infrastructure for a long-term scientific program that could survive discovery and disruption. This was much more sophisticated than we originally realized. The discovery led to a new international investigation that ultimately identified backup facilities in Belgium, Australia, and northern Canada. The global scope of Van Houten's research network had been hidden by careful compartmentalization and sophisticated operational security that had taken decades to develop. Emma's reaction to learning about the hidden facility was complex. On one hand, she was relieved that the materials had been found and destroyed before they could be used to restart the research. On the other hand, she was disturbed by the realization that our family's connection to the network was even deeper and more complicated than we'd understood. It means Great-Grandpa Joe was planning for us to be involved all along, she said during a family therapy session. He didn't just want to recruit Dad. He wanted to set up our whole family to be guardians of his research legacy. Dr. Martinez helped us process the implications of this revelation. This doesn't change who your family is or the choices you've made, she reminded us. Your grandfather's plans for manipulating you don't define your identity. What defines you is how you've consistently chosen to do the right thing when faced with his legacy. The discovery of the hidden facility and the international investigation that followed brought our family back into the public spotlight in ways that were both positive and challenging. Emma was invited to speak at international conferences about recognizing and disrupting sophisticated criminal networks. I was asked to consult with agricultural security agencies about identifying suspicious research activities. But the attention also brought new threats from conspiracy theorists and environmental extremists who saw grandfather as a martyr and our family as traitors to his mission. We had to install security systems at our home and coordinate with local law enforcement about potential harassment or threats. The irony is that by trying to protect people from his research, we've become targets of people who believed in that research, Jennifer observed during one of our security briefings. Emma, now a senior in high school, handled the renewed attention with remarkable maturity. She developed sophisticated media skills and a clear sense of purpose about using our family's experience to educate people about manipulation and extremism. "I used to be embarrassed about our family history," she told an interviewer from a national news magazine. "Now I understand that what happened to us is part of a much larger pattern of how extremist groups operate. By talking about our experience, we can help other families recognize dangerous situations before it's too late." Her college application essays focused on her plans to study psychology and criminology, with the ultimate goal of working with federal agencies to identify and disrupt dangerous cult activities. Several universities offered her full scholarships, recognizing both her academic achievements and her unique experience with the subject matter she wanted to study. "I want to prevent other families from going through what we went through," she wrote in her personal statement. "But I also want to help families who have gone through similar experiences understand that they can heal and move forward, while still honoring their responsibility to protect others." As Emma prepared to leave for college, our family reflected on how completely our lives had been transformed by that initial discovery in grandfather's cornfield 7 years earlier. We'd gone from being an ordinary suburban family to being national advocates for cult awareness and victim protection. The financial costs had been enormous: legal bills, security expenses, and career disruptions that had taken years to recover from. The emotional costs had been equally significant: trauma, anxiety, and the ongoing challenge of living with public scrutiny and occasional threats. But we'd also gained things we never could have anticipated. Emma had developed exceptional maturity, empathy, and leadership skills. Jennifer and I had deepened our relationship through shared adversity and common purpose. Our family had found meaning in helping others navigate similar challenges. Most importantly, we'd learned that family legacy isn't just what you inherit, it's what you choose to do with that inheritance. We'd inherited a legacy of scientific extremism, manipulation, and harm. We'd chosen to transform that legacy into a commitment to justice, education, and protection of vulnerable people. The morning Emma left for college, she stood in the backyard looking toward the distant hills where grandfather's farm had once been. The memorial site was barely visible from our house, just a green space that looked peaceful and ordinary from a distance. "I'm not running away from this," she told me as we loaded her car. "I'm running towards something better, but I'll never forget where I came from, or what our family learned about the importance of choosing good over evil." As I watched her drive away, I realized that grandfather's ultimate plan had failed completely. He'd intended to recruit our family into his extremist vision, to use our love and loyalty to perpetuate his research. Instead, his actions had created a family committed to exposing and preventing exactly the kind of manipulation and harm he'd represented. Emma would spend her college years studying the psychology of extremism and the sociology of cult recruitment. She would graduate with multiple degrees and join the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. She would help identify and disrupt networks similar to the one grandfather had created. But that's a story for another time. For now, it was enough to know that the seeds grandfather had tried to plant in our family's soil had grown into something he never could have imagined. A commitment to justice that would last for generations. A determination to protect others that would define our family's true legacy. The monsters were gone, the victims were protected, and our daughter was free to choose her own path forward. But she would walk that path carrying the wisdom earned through our family's encounter with evil, armed with the knowledge that ordinary people have extraordinary power to choose good when evil seems easier. That choice, made over and over again through years of challenge and growth, had transformed our inheritance from a curse into a calling. We'd learned to live not in the shadow of what had been hidden in grandfather's fields, but in the light of what we'd chosen to plant in their place. And that light would continue to grow, generation after generation, ensuring that the darkness we'd discovered would never again be allowed to take root in our family's soil. As I watched her drive away, I realized that grandfather's ultimate plan had failed completely. He'd intended to recruit our family into his extremist vision, to use our love and loyalty to perpetuate his research. Instead, his actions had created a family committed to exposing and preventing exactly the kind of manipulation and harm he'd represented. Emma would spend her college years studying the psychology of extremism and the sociology of cult recruitment. She would graduate with multiple degrees and join the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. She would help identify and disrupt networks similar to the one grandfather had created. But that's a story for another time. For now, it was enough to know that the seeds grandfather had tried to plant in our family's soil had grown into something he never could have imagined. A commitment to justice that would last for generations. A determination to protect others that would define our family's true legacy. Emma's freshman year at Georgetown was challenging in ways we hadn't fully anticipated. While she'd grown up with public attention and media scrutiny, being on a college campus where she was known primarily as the plant horror girl created new social dynamics she had to navigate. Her roommate, Sarah Chen, had initially been excited about rooming with someone famous, but quickly realized that Emma's story was more complex and traumatic than the sensationalized media coverage had suggested. "I thought it would be cool to room with someone who'd been on TV," Sarah told me during Parents' Weekend. "But then I learned what she'd actually been through, and I felt terrible for treating her trauma like entertainment." Emma handled these situations with the grace she'd developed through years of therapy and public speaking. She'd learned to educate people about the difference between notoriety and accomplishment, between being famous for something that happened to you versus being respected for what you chose to do in response. Her professors in the psychology and criminology departments were initially cautious about having such a high-profile student in their classes. They worried that her presence might distract from academic discussions or turn class sessions into therapy for her personal trauma. But Emma quickly proved that her interest in extremist psychology was academic rather than merely personal. She asks the most sophisticated questions I've heard from an undergraduate. Drive. Patricia Hernandez, her abnormal psychology professor, told me during a parent conference. She's not trying to process her own experience in class. She's trying to understand the broader patterns that could help identify and prevent similar situations. Emma's senior thesis focused on what she termed legacy recruitment, the strategies extremist groups use to involve family members of deceased leaders in continuing their missions. Her research had started with her own family's experience, but expanded to examine similar patterns in religious cults, political extremist movements, and other ideological organizations. Many extremist leaders develop sophisticated plans for perpetuating their movements through family inheritance, she wrote in her thesis abstract. These plans often involve emotional manipulation, legal structures, and psychological conditioning that can affect family members for generations after the original leader's death. Her thesis advisor, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, encouraged her to expand the research into a publishable paper. "This is genuinely original scholarship," he told her. "You're identifying recruitment patterns that haven't been systematically studied before." The paper was published in the Journal of Extremist Studies during Emma's senior year, making her one of the youngest people ever to publish original research in that field. The publication led to speaking invitations from law enforcement agencies and academic conferences around the world. But success in college didn't mean Emma's healing process was complete. During her junior year, she experienced what Dr. Martinez identified as delayed onset trauma symptoms related to the full scope of what grandfather had done. As her understanding of psychology deepened, she began to grasp aspects of the abuse and manipulation that she'd been too young to fully comprehend when it was happening. "I'm realizing that everything about my childhood was shaped by his evil," she told me during a particularly difficult phone conversation. "Even the good memories are contaminated because they happened in the context of this massive deception and ongoing harm to other people." Jennifer and I drove to Georgetown that weekend to help Emma through what her therapist was calling a meaning-making crisis, a period when trauma survivors sometimes struggle to integrate new understanding of their experiences with their existing sense of identity and purpose. "The work you're doing now is partially possible because of what you experienced then," Dr. Martinez reminded Emma during a video therapy session. "Your childhood gave you insights into manipulation and extremism that most researchers could never develop through academic study alone. The question is whether you can honor the pain of that experience while also recognizing the unique gifts it's given you." This perspective helped Emma reframe her relationship with her family history. Instead of seeing her childhood as purely victimized or contaminated, she began to understand it as preparation for the work she was uniquely qualified to do. During her senior year, Emma was recruited by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit for their elite training program. Agent Williams, who'd become something of a mentor to our family, personally recommended Emma for the position. "We need people who understand extremist psychology from the inside," Agent Williams explained. "Emma has lived experience that can't be replicated through training or academic study. She's also demonstrated the emotional stability and analytical skills necessary for this kind of work." The FBI training program was intense, requiring Emma to study active cases involving cult recruitment, domestic terrorism, and organized extremist movements. Her unique background made her valuable to investigations involving agricultural terrorism, environmental extremism, and family-based recruitment networks. Her first major case assignment involved a situation eerily similar to our own family's experience. A property in Montana had been inherited by a young man whose grandfather had been involved in anti-government extremist activities. Unlike our situation, this young man had been recruited into continuing his grandfather's mission rather than exposing it. The parallel case helped me understand how easily things could have gone differently for our family, Emma told me after the Montana investigation was completed. If grandfather had been more careful about his recruitment approach, if dad had been more isolated or vulnerable, if we hadn't had strong family relationships and community support, we might have become perpetrators instead of whistleblowers. The Montana case also revealed that networks like grandfathers were more common than law enforcement had previously realized. Extremist ideologies were often passed down through families using inheritance structures, emotional manipulation, and gradual indoctrination techniques that were difficult to detect from outside. Emma's work with the FBI led to the development of new protocols for investigating inherited extremism cases. Her insights helped create training programs for social workers, probate lawyers, and other professionals who might encounter situations where family inheritance was being used to perpetuate dangerous ideologies. Emma's contribution to our understanding of family-based extremist recruitment has been invaluable, Agent Williams told a congressional subcommittee reviewing domestic terrorism prevention strategies. Her research has helped us identify and disrupt several networks that might otherwise have operated undetected for years. But Emma's success came with personal costs. The work was emotionally demanding, requiring her to regularly confront the kinds of manipulation and abuse that had shaped her own childhood. She struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and occasional periods of depression that required ongoing therapeutic support. More challenging was the social isolation that came with her career choice. Dating was complicated when your job involved investigating extremist networks, and your family history included being victimized by cult activity. Many potential romantic partners were either frightened by her background or inappropriately fascinated by it. "I feel like I can never just be a normal person," she confided during one of our weekly phone calls. "Either people see me as damaged goods because of what happened to our family, or they see me as some kind of expert who can analyze every relationship and social situation. I just want to be Emma sometimes, not the girl whose great-grandfather was a monster." This struggle with identity and normalcy led Emma to seek therapy specifically focused on helping her develop relationships and life experiences that weren't defined by her family trauma or her professional specialization. She needed to learn how to exist as a complete person rather than just as a response to grandfather's crimes. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a therapist who specialized in helping crime victims and law enforcement professionals maintain emotional balance, helped Emma understand that she needed to actively cultivate aspects of her identity that had nothing to do with extremism, investigation, or family trauma. "You've become so skilled at being the person who helps others deal with these issues that you've forgotten how to be the person who enjoys life independently of those issues," Dr. Walsh observed. "You need permission to have interests, relationships, and experiences that aren't connected to your family's story or your professional mission." This realization led Emma to deliberately pursue hobbies and friendships that had nothing to do with her work or her family history. She took up rock climbing, joined a community theater group, and started volunteering at an animal shelter, activities that allowed her to experience competence and connection in contexts completely removed from extremism and investigation. The diversification of her interests and social connections helped Emma develop a more balanced sense of identity. She was still committed to her FBI work and to honoring our family's responsibility to prevent similar tragedies. But she was also able to enjoy life as a young adult with normal interests and relationships. During her 3rd year with the FBI, Emma met David Park, a veterinarian who knew nothing about her family history when they first started dating. He was attracted to her intelligence and intensity, without understanding the specific experiences that had shaped those qualities. "I didn't tell him about the family stuff for months," Emma admitted when she finally introduced David to us. "I wanted to know that he could like me for who I am now, not because he was fascinated by my trauma or felt sorry for what I'd been through." David's initial reaction to learning about our family's history was exactly what Emma had hoped for: concern for her well-being and respect for how she'd chosen to respond to difficult circumstances, without either pity or sensationalized fascination. "What impressed me most was how she'd turned something so terrible into something constructive," David told me during their first visit to our home. "She could have let it destroy her or define her negatively, but instead she used it to help other people. That takes incredible strength and character." Their relationship developed slowly and carefully, with Emma working to ensure that her family trauma and professional demands didn't overwhelm their connection. David proved to be patient and supportive, understanding that Emma needed someone who could provide stability and normalcy, rather than additional intensity or drama. Meanwhile, Jennifer and I were navigating our own ongoing relationship with the legacy of grandfather's crimes. The international investigation that had followed the discovery of the hidden facility had led to several more arrests and the dismantling of research networks in multiple countries. But it had also revealed that the full scope of Van Houten's influence might never be completely understood. We estimate that research inspired by Van Houten's theories was being conducted at more than 20 locations worldwide, Agent Williams reported during a briefing about the final phase of the international investigation. Some of these operations were shut down decades ago, but others may have continued until very recently. The possibility that victims of similar experiments might still be living in various locations around the world meant that our family's advocacy work was far from over. We continued to consult with international law enforcement agencies, provide testimony for legislative hearings, and support victim services organizations. But we also had to learn to live with the uncertainty that came with being connected to something larger than any individual investigation could fully resolve. There would always be unanswered questions about the full extent of the network grandfather had been part of. And there would always be the possibility that new evidence might emerge, requiring our family to relive difficult memories and public scrutiny. Part of healing from this kind of trauma is learning to accept that some things will never be fully resolved, Dr. Martinez reminded us during one of our periodic family check-ins. "You can't control every consequence of what your grandfather did, but you can control how you choose to respond to ongoing developments." This acceptance allowed Jennifer and me to gradually reduce our level of involvement in investigation and advocacy work, transitioning from being primary sources and consultants to being occasional advisors and supporters of others who were taking leadership roles in prevention and victim services. The transition felt both relieving and guilty-inducing. We were grateful to step back from the intensity and constant reminders of our family's trauma, but we also felt responsible for continuing to help in whatever ways we could. Emma helped us understand that stepping back didn't mean abandoning our responsibilities. "You guys have done more than anyone could have expected," she told us. "You exposed the network, you helped with investigations, you've spent years helping other families and supporting policy changes. You don't have to carry this forever." As Emma's relationship with David became more serious, our family began to grapple with questions about how to integrate new family members into our complex history and ongoing responsibilities. David was supportive and understanding, but he hadn't chosen to be connected to our family's legacy in the way that Emma had inherited it. "I love Emma, and that means accepting everything that comes with loving her," David told us when Emma was considering whether to accept a marriage proposal. "I understand that being part of your family means being part of something larger than just personal relationships. I'm prepared for that." Their wedding was a small, private ceremony that deliberately focused on celebrating their love and future together, rather than dwelling on the difficult history that had shaped Emma's path to that moment. We invited Dr. Martinez, Agent Williams, and several of the victim advocates who'd become extended family over the years of working together. Emma's wedding speech included a brief acknowledgement of how our family's experience had taught her about the importance of choosing love over fear, community over isolation, and hope over despair. But mostly, she talked about her excitement for building a life with David that would be defined by their shared values and dreams, rather than by inherited trauma. "I'm grateful for everything that brought me to this moment," she said, "including the difficult experiences that taught me how precious normal happiness really is." As Emma and David settled into married life, they had to navigate the ongoing demands of Emma's FBI career and the occasional media attention that still followed our family when new developments emerged in extremist research cases. David proved to be remarkably adaptable, learning to handle the security precautions and privacy measures that were necessary given Emma's work. 2 years after their wedding, Emma and David welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Sarah, after the grandmother she would never meet, but whose legacy of protection and love she would inherit. "Holding my granddaughter for the first time, I felt the same sense of completion and hope that I'd experienced when Emma was born. This baby represented the ultimate victory over grandfather's plans for our family. Instead of perpetuating his extremist research, instead of being recruited into his vision of transformed humanity, our family had produced a new generation that would grow up knowing the importance of choosing good over evil, of protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. She's going to grow up knowing that her family fought monsters and won," Emma said as she nursed baby Sarah in the same hospital where Emma had been born 30 years earlier. "But more importantly, she's going to grow up knowing that love is stronger than evil, and that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort." As I write this, Sarah is now 5 years old, a bright and curious child who knows that her family has an unusual history but doesn't yet understand the full scope of what that history includes. Emma and David are raising her with the same careful balance of honesty and protection that Jennifer and I tried to maintain with Emma, sharing age-appropriate truths while preserving her sense of safety and innocence. The memorial site that was once grandfather's farm has become a place of pilgrimage for people studying extremism, cult recovery, and family trauma. Educational programs are offered there for law enforcement professionals, social workers, and family members of cult victims. The facility includes a research library that houses documentation from our case and similar investigations around the world. Emma serves on the memorial's advisory board, helping to ensure that the educational programs accurately represent the experiences of families affected by extremist recruitment, and that the site serves as a genuine resource for prevention rather than just a monument to past horrors. The goal is to make sure that what happened to our family and to grandfather's victims leads to better protection for future potential victims, Emma explained during the memorial's 5th anniversary ceremony. "We can't undo the harm that was done, but we can use our experience to prevent similar harm from happening to others." The memorial also serves as a meeting place for support groups and advocacy organizations. Families who've dealt with cult recruitment, survivors of various forms of extremist violence, and professionals working in prevention and recovery gather there regularly to share experiences and coordinate efforts. Jennifer and I attend these gatherings occasionally, but we've gradually transitioned from being leaders in the movement to being elder advisors who can provide perspective and encouragement to newer activists and survivors. Our role now is to demonstrate that families can heal and move forward while still honoring their responsibilities to help others. The financial and legal consequences of grandfather's crimes were finally resolved about 10 years after our initial discovery. Settlement funds from various insurance claims and legal judgments were used to establish a foundation that provides support services for families affected by cult recruitment and extremist manipulation. The foundation, managed jointly by victim advocates and law enforcement professionals, funds research into prevention strategies, provides financial assistance for families dealing with cult-related trauma, and supports legislative efforts to strengthen protections against manipulative recruitment tactics. Your family's decision to fight rather than hide has created resources that will help people for generations, the Foundation's director told us during the 10th anniversary of the first FBI raid. "The money is important, but the expertise and advocacy that grew out of your experience is even more valuable." As our granddaughter Sarah grows older, she asks increasingly sophisticated questions about why her family is involved in helping people who've been hurt by bad groups. Emma has begun sharing simple stories about how families sometimes have to work together to protect people from others who make harmful choices. Great-great-grandpa Joe made very bad choices that hurt people, Emma explained to 5-year-old Sarah. So our family decided to spend our lives helping the people he hurt and making sure no one else gets hurt the same way. Are there still bad groups? Sarah asked with the direct curiosity of childhood. Yes, but there are many more good people working to stop them. And one of the things that makes people good is that they choose to help others instead of hurting them. These conversations remind me of similar discussions I had with Emma at the same age, trying to help her understand difficult concepts about human nature and moral responsibility without overwhelming her with adult concerns. The cycle continues, but each generation is better equipped to recognize and respond to manipulation and extremism. Emma's work with the FBI has evolved to include training other agents in recognizing family-based extremist recruitment and developing policies for supporting families who report suspicious activities by relatives. Her unique combination of lived experience and professional expertise has made her one of the most respected experts in her field. But perhaps more importantly, she's learned to maintain balance between her professional mission and her personal life. She and David have created a home environment where their daughter can grow up knowing about her family's history without being defined or burdened by it. The house we live in now is different from the one we occupied during the initial crisis. We moved several years ago to a neighborhood where our family history was less well known, allowing us to interact with neighbors and participate in community activities without constant awareness of our unusual circumstances. Jennifer returned to work in a new field, victim advocacy, where her experience with our family's trauma was professionally valuable rather than personally limiting. She helps other families navigate the legal and emotional challenges that come with discovering that relatives have been involved in criminal activities. What we learned is that healing from family-based trauma requires building new identity narratives that honor the past without being trapped by it, Jennifer explained during a workshop she presented for victim services professionals. Families need permission to move forward while still acknowledging their responsibilities to help others who face similar challenges. The work has been fulfilling for Jennifer in ways that her previous career never was. She's found meaning in using our difficult experience to help others, while also developing professional expertise that's valued independently of our personal story. As for me, I've returned to work in a modified version of my original field, financial planning for nonprofit organizations. Many of my clients are victim services organizations, prevention programs, and research institutions working on issues related to our family's experience. I'm able to contribute specialized knowledge while using professional skills that I developed before our lives were disrupted by grandfather's legacy. The work feels like a natural integration of who I was before the discovery and who I became afterward. I'm not defined by being a survivor or a victim's family member, but I'm also not pretending that those experiences didn't fundamentally change my perspective and priorities. Looking back on the 20 years that have passed since I first inherited grandfather's farm, I'm struck by how completely our family was transformed by what we found growing in those fields. We lost our innocence, our financial security, our privacy, and our simple sense of family identity. But we gained something precious in return, the knowledge that we were capable of choosing good over evil, truth over comfortable lies, and justice over family loyalty when those values conflicted. We learned that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they're willing to sacrifice comfort for conscience. Most importantly, we discovered that love really is stronger than evil, not because love always prevents bad things from happening, but because love gives people the strength to respond to bad things in ways that create meaning and prevent future harm. Our granddaughter Sarah will grow up knowing that her family faced a terrible test and passed it. She'll understand that being part of our family means being part of a legacy of people who chose to protect others rather than protect themselves. She'll know that even when trusted relatives prove to be monsters, families can still choose to be forces for good in the world. The seeds that grandfather tried to plant in our family's soil never took root. Instead, we planted something better, a commitment to justice that will last for generations, a determination to protect the vulnerable that will define our family's true legacy. The monsters are gone, the victims are safe, and our children are free to choose their own paths forward. But they walk those paths carrying the wisdom earned through our family's encounter with evil, armed with the knowledge that ordinary people have extraordinary power to choose good when evil seems easier. That choice, made over and over again through decades of challenge and growth, transformed our inheritance from a curse into a calling. We learned to live not in the shadow of what had been hidden in grandfather's fields, but in the light of what we chose to plant in their place. And that light continues to grow, generation after generation, ensuring that the darkness we discovered will never again be allowed to take root in our family's soil. The farm is gone, but the love remains. And in the end, that's the only inheritance that truly matters. That choice, made over and over again through decades of challenge and growth, transformed our inheritance from a curse into a calling. We learned to live not in the shadow of what had been hidden in grandfather's fields, but in the light of what we chose to plant in their place. And that light continues to grow generation after generation, ensuring that the darkness we discovered will never again be allowed to take root in our family's soil. The farm is gone, but the love remains. And in the end, that's the only inheritance that truly matters.